just to keep going with the agenda today. But I want to introduce my first speakers from my team. But before I do that, I want to ask you, who of you use Google Universal Analytics in your data stacks? Or, you know what? I'll ask, who of you don't use Google Analytics? Okay, a few of you. You will still learn. A few of our colleagues are intensively working with Google Analytics, implementing it, integrating the data with other data, improving it. And one colleague who's very passionate about it is Veronica. She's actually a scientist and she did a lot of research in academia. So if one person knows anything about data quality, it's her. But she was not able to come today. We're very sad, and she was also. But two colleagues of mine are taking over for her. They're also very good and were intensively involved. And the stage is yours.
Thank you so much.
Tim and Pippa.
You can already tell what a huge loss it is that Vero can't be here today. It takes two of us to replace her today. I hope you still take a lot out of this session where we're going to talk about Google Analytics 4. It has been one of the hottest topics in recent months, and so when Google recently announced that it's going to deprecate Universal Analytics next year, there's a bit of a difference between free and paid, but it's coming next year. The initial reaction of pretty much everyone was but I guess at some point it's time to get back out of the bush and actually figure out how do we deal with this situation, how do we tackle this. And we have been involved in a couple of projects with Portfolio Ventures already, where we have implemented GA4. We are in the process of doing it with others. So yeah, we want to talk about this tool and what it actually means to go for it.
So, and how are the next couple of minutes going to look like? So first we basically want to set the stage a little bit. Going to explain you how to prepare for the migration. Then we want to give you kind of a practical framework, which we also use basically for our migrations. And then we're going to elaborate a little bit on the advantages GA4 has over Universal Analytics, because we need to embrace it anyway. So let's basically point out the positive things. And then obviously, after every migration, is it a database, is it a new tool, there will be differences, and we want to prepare you for some questions. Why are the sessions different this time, or why are the conversion events maybe deviating a little bit? And the last point will be basically if GA4 is actually maybe the right tool for you, or maybe not the right tool for you. So basically we need to do some small modifications, because Universal Analytics is more than 10 years old. I think it comes from the days when I think the first apps, or the first iPhone came out in 2007. So actually it's a long time ago. I think Universal Analytics is actually even older. So it comes from basically an era where we probably used Windows XP or Windows Vista or something like this. Crazy days. And that's why we need to adapt our tracking scripts a little bit to be prepared now for 2022. And what are the kind of the things you need to take care of? So in the best case scenario, you would already implement GA4 as soon as possible. So literally next couple of weeks, hopefully you maybe even have it, to have some year-on-year benchmarks. I mean, obviously January will be a little bit difficult, but at least then you could do a July and August benchmark next summer. Also, you can build your Google Ads remarketing audience, or basically transfer the audience you created in Universal Analytics and basically recreate it in GA4 too. Basically, point the Google Ads audiences to GA4. Then one very cool thing which made me quite excited was the raw data exploration, because whoever basically tried to get user level data, event level data, or even just single reports, but on a big data volume out of Universal Analytics, probably knows the pains with the pagination of 10K results only, and so on. And yeah, now with GA4, you have basically a free Google Analytics BigQuery export on event level data, which is basically free to use and play around with. And with this, then obviously there are lots of user and event level insights you could potentially generate it and pull out of it. And GA4 also brings you some predictive audiences and predictive, basically user segments or predictions on a user level, which you basically at least could benchmark and have a look at if they might be useful and actually accurate for you. But I mean, it's for free, so have a look into it, right? So, and yeah, so to wrap it up, make sure that the data flow across the marketing pipeline is properly set up with the remarketing audience, for example. You have analysis on this event level data, which could be especially relevant for product analytics. You need to make sure, now with GA4, one of the mindset switches is obviously that if you remember in Universal Analytics, you basically have a different property for every single data source, for your DE domain, for your .com domain, for your Android app, for your iOS app, whereas now with GA4 basically you can have multiple streams all unified together in one single property, which is also quite a cool thing and a more modern approach of tackling those things. And by default, which was also, for me, was quite a big news, but I don't know, the media outlash wasn't that big, that basically the default attribution nowadays with GA4 is also data-driven. So basically it's fractional credits. So it's not that one order or one touch point becomes 100% of the order, but it's basically broken down into 17 and 83% or so. And basically this is per default, just also a little bit of a black box. So that's something to consider. But yeah, so how to do it? Hopefully not randomly pressing buttons, but have a little bit more of a systematic approach here.
Exactly. And one system that we found to address this is one that is actually kind of established in the industry, which is a framework that can be referred to as the pivot framework. So it starts with a planning phase, goes into the implementation, then you actually validate everything that's going on, then you do thorough onboarding with everyone who has to use the tools, who has to use the data, who has to work with what you're producing. And then lastly, you can look into how to further then transform the data that's coming out of it, how you can actually leverage it for other stuff as well. But since just 5 words are a bit abstract, we also wanted to provide you a bit of insight of how we actually think about these 5 steps and what sort of prototypical steps would be in an implementation plan for something like this. So let's look, for example, at planning. This is put on a timeline. The timeline will obviously vary depending on the size of your implementation, of the scope of your tracking setup, etc., etc. So there is a lot of topics that you need to consider in order to figure out how to actually perform this. But yeah, starting with planning, you basically look at the existing setup that you have, right? For most, that will be a Universal Analytics setup where you have a certain element of tracking in place. We obviously want to leverage that, right? You don't want to start completely from scratch, but you want to make sure that all of the learnings you previously had, all of the infrastructure that is already in place, sort of informs your decision making in this new setup as well. In our case, relevant accesses come in when we come in from the outside. Obviously, we first also need to make sure that we have accesses to everything that works. If you are already an internal user, that might already be in place, might not be. In that case, get on it. That's also something that sometimes takes a bit of time. So that's good to know. Then you have to look into how do you actually want to set up the account. Nowadays with J4, there are a lot of settings that you have to set on the account level or that you can set at the account level. We can really make sure that everything is working nicely. These 2 weeks of planning in our mind are also especially relevant because you really want to come up with your measurement plan. You don't really want to rush into it and just go at it and just start implementing something right away. You really want to think about what are we actually measuring, why are we measuring it, and what sort of decision making will it inform later on. I think that's a theme that we touched upon a lot in these last 1.5 days, right? Like talking to the stakeholders and figuring out why do they actually want to track something, why do they actually need this information. So that's why we think this planning phase is especially important. But then afterwards, obviously, you still want to get your hands dirty, right? Then we go into the implementation. Implementation in this case also means having another look at universal analytics. You don't want to lose all that data that you already gathered over previous months, years, whatever, how long you have already been tracking things. We know from Google so far, that you are still going to have some access to the universal analytics properties once the system is deprecated, but they will delete it at some point. At the moment, the communication is 6 months after shutoff. Let's see, but ideally having a plan in place on how to make sure that that data is stored somewhere and that you can use it later on is super important. Then when it goes into the actual GA4 implementation, you set up these new data streams. The data stream is basically the term that Google uses to refer to the sources that you set up to bring data into your Google Analytics setup. When you're already looking at the implementation of your tracking, it's always a very good idea to, at that point, also double check that consent management is in place, that everything is done in accordance to the relevant legal environment that you're operating in. There are variances across countries, but in general in Europe, I think are quite tough rules in place, and we've got to make sure that those are actually followed. Then, speaking of getting your hands dirty, you actually implement the events. That's the fun part, right? Like really getting into it, figuring out how the events are being sent into the systems, making sure they work, testing them out, that sort of thing. And then you connect your GA4 setup into all of these other tools that interact with it, right? You want to make sure that you can then actually use those connections within the Google Workspace, ads to BigQuery to look into. Then we validate. Validation is super important because you don't want to just have a tracking setup in place. We heard it before, for example, from Annika. You don't want someone to set up an event without telling anyone and without validating it works and is only being fired once and not multiple times, that sort of thing. So validation is crucial. We also put down aligning on data variance. Obviously, with some changes between systems, there's always going to be a bit of variance between those systems, right? GA4 is not necessarily going to show the same thing as Universal Analytics. There might be differences. And being upfront about that and communicating that early makes your life so much easier. Then, onboarding. This is where we get to talk to our stakeholders a lot again. This is really about making sure that all this data, all these insights that we can produce now actually reach the stakeholder, that we have the relevant dashboards for them, the relevant analyses for them, really making sure that what we are tracking now reaches our colleagues. And then, lastly, transformation. This is the super fun part where we especially rely on our colleagues that are over in the other building now, where they then get to leverage all of this data that we're producing, ideally in the raw format, and then get to play with it, build upon it, and also look into the machine learning capabilities of GA4. There's just so much stuff you can do with the data once you're at this point. So, now you want to know what does GA4 actually offer us. And let's start with the part about the general admin and the account settings. So I already mentioned data stream is basically this new format of getting data into Google Analytics. This is a lot more unified than it was in Universal Analytics. It allows you to connect web apps, websites, your apps, be it iOS, be it Android, and really collect everything into one single place. Then we have user access control. So GA4 makes it a bit easier than Universal Analytics to really fine-tune who can access what, who can look at what, who can interact with what sort of data, what level.
Then we have the IP anonymization. If you remember in the UA days, GA3 days, basically you needed to explicitly anonymize IPs. Nowadays this is kind of more or less done automatically. And additionally you have native integrations. Again, highlighting the BigQuery integration, which basically enables so many use cases if you basically have some know-how how to use event-level raw data.
Then it goes on to cross-domain tracking. Whoever worked with UA4 will know that was really a pain in the ass. Now it's gotten a lot easier. You just throw the same tag, the same GTM setup onto both pages, for example, both the main page and your subdomain, and it will just work. That's so nice. I guess the animations on this slide are a bit
we have
wonky.
Event-based data model. So basically the big difference between the web world and the app world is that on a website basically you have page views and you know basically exactly what page has been shown, whereas in a mobile application it's a little bit different. So I mean some providers call it screens, but basically it's a lot more smooth or fluent or fuzzy, basically what is now a different page view compared to another one. That's why basically in the mobile world, ignore page views, it's called events, and basically GA embraces this too.
And then another thing that GA4 makes a lot easier, not just cross-domain tracking, but also what they called enhanced measurement. So there are a couple of things that they just track automatically. It's just so much easier than setting it all up yourself. That is things like clicking, scrolling, sort of engaging with the page. There are a bunch of things where they are just like, okay, this is relevant for you, just use it. We don't want you to have to set everything up manually.
And we have the attribution modeling. So as said earlier, basically now you have this fractional data-driven multi-touch attribution per default. And you can also define your custom events without the need of tag manager, without the need of software developers. Basically, you can do it within the UI. Then we have conversion tracking. So similar to this, basically you can fire conversion based on multiple criteria, make it quite advanced actually.
We have audiences that were powered up in GA4 a lot. You can basically customize your conversion logic based on audiences that you created. And you also have a better view at what data is actually being sampled. So UA did a lot of data sampling where reports were just built on a subset of the data. And in GA4 you have the advantage that that generally is the case. You get always the full view of what's happening.
And you have this debugging mode. So it's similar basically to the preview mode in Google Tag Manager. Basically you then have a new browser session where you can interact with your website or mobile app, and you can directly see kind of what is sent over to GA4 and how basically the events are considered within the tool. Yeah.
Then looking at engagement, GA4 basically remodels a bit how they think about if a user actually engages with what you are offering them. So both on the web, but also in apps. A lot more potent than having to measure it yourself. And then custom dimensions. Basically, this entire setup of custom dimensions and custom metrics got refined and just got a lot easier and a lot more manageable. So I think everyone who will do the switch will be quite happy about seeing that aspect of it.
Also in GA3 you had lots of predefined reports, whereas nowadays in GA4 the trend is more to basically build your own stuff, because probably Google realized that lots of different use cases exist and one report doesn't fit all the use cases, so basically they rather said put yourself within the tool or use the raw data and plug in a Google Data Studio or visualization tool of your choice to basically answer your questions. And then, as said, the machine learning features, I mean, they come for free, they're there anyway, so have a look if they actually apply and serve you some benefit. And to make your stakeholders not look like Barton, basically, we also want to explain a little bit the differences which might pop up.
Yeah. Here, I think we gotta go a bit quicker because realizing that we obviously jumped in, we have a bit less of a handle on the time, and we got gently advised that we don't have a lot of it left. But basically, if you look now at what we talked about previously, where now you don't have just page views, but page views and screens, sort of the combination of the setup, that will obviously differ now in your reporting as well, right? Because that has to be combined into one logic, and so this concept of a page view is not the same as it was before.
Again, sessions. Sessions are also a little bit different in a mobile context. So especially with basically minimizing the app and switching to a different one, like this session duration doesn't apply anymore. That's why also GA4 it's non-existent. So the legendary 30 minutes of inactivity don't apply here anymore, and it's much more event and mobile first driven. And also remember, I mean, every use case is different, but probably 60, 70, 80% of your traffic at least is mobile, if not 100%. So this is for sure more relevant here.
Then we have user accounts. Everyone who works with that will definitely see changes in how that looks in GA4 now. Basically, they look a bit differently about who is a user, who's active, that sort of thing. And I think what is especially important and really a benefit of GA4 is like returning users are captured in a better way than previously. Previously, there was just a big overlap between who's actually new, who's an existing user. It was much harder to understand. GA4 is better at making the distinction. But both are still able to utilize either the client ID that Google assigns when you're browsing or a user ID that you provide yourself from internal systems, for example.
And again, one of this mindset shift is that because you don't have page views anymore, but everything is a little bit more event-based, basically you can also have multiple events, therefore multiple conversions basically for a single session and user actually. So that's something to consider. And also that, that your data, because of the probabilistic modeling, can also change actually up to 7 days in advance. So similar to how you have it maybe already seen at Facebook. It's not that basically the data you see on Monday will stick until Friday. So this is for sure something we need to start living with.
And then lastly, site engagement. As we mentioned, that is a concept that's a bit new in GA4, and it really looks at how much time are people actually engaging with your site, which is like a real mindset shift and actually looking at engagement with your content, be it on the web or in the app. So the question now is a GA4 migration actually the right choice for you? I would say we can skip this slide. This is sort of the considerations that you might need to take. Can talk about those in more detail. More discussion rounds and exchanges, but I think what is the bigger and more relevant point is what are actually alternatives? What are things that work really well in either one or the other?
So from basically our point of view, Google Analytics, let it be GA3, let it be GA4, is really a jack of all trades. It's a great tool to start with, and then basically it can cover more or less everything you need, but it's completely normal during the stage of basically becoming a more mature organization, also with the data use cases, to have some best in breeds tool here. So maybe a Google Optimize doesn't do the job anymore, so you basically outsource your A/B testing. Maybe your product analytics is not really covered by the stuff you can see in GA. So you need a heap, you need the amplitude, you need the mix panel. So basically it's maybe also the attribution, the data-driven black box of GA4, or basically the custom rules you couldn't do a GA3 and don't do the job anymore. So you either completely do it in-house or you get a dedicated attribution tool. So basically those are things to consider. So that's why it's maybe also now a good time to consider actually if GA itself is still the best tool for all of your use cases.
And one point that Vero wanted us to stress is that does not mean that you shouldn't implement GA4 at all. It could always be one of the best scenarios that you actually use GA4 and other tools. Because at the end of the day, GA4 can do a lot of things and does offer you a lot of capabilities for free. For example, it's Google Tag Manager, for example, is probably still best in breed for that setup. But then on the other hand, we noted on, especially attribution, product analytics, there are just other tools out there that are better suited. And I think with that, from the data analytics team, we wanted to say thank you for your attention. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. Okay.
You have a few minutes for questions. Anyone in the round or applause?
That's, by the way, from our most recent team outing. Very fun day.
Only about Google Analytics.
Not about Google.
Anyone for questions?
Are you sure this is? Oh, okay. These mics are very intimate. You need to. So thank you guys for the presentation. Just maybe one warning and one question. Google pushes really hard on this user recognition. GA4 is better in user recognition. Still, as far as I know, still cookie-based. The same as for site analytics tool on Earth is still cookie-based. So Google might have some of them to recognize the user, but I think to keep it in mind, those reports are still to be enjoyed with caution. So this is just as a remark because it's so often, and I think it's very dangerous, misleading to base any decisions. But my question was, last time I checked, and it's been months ago, GA4 was not ready, in spite of having the custom dimensions provided. They were not ready to implement these custom dimensions backwards to AdWords, for instance. So if you if you wanted to have your own traffic channel, you were not able to feed them backwards with optimizations. You either had to work like given list them, you know, or you work with custom dimensions, you have to come up with a custom integration. Do you have some information on whether that changed or whether there's some good ways to go about it?
So it's about the custom channel grouping. Did I understand that
yes.
right? Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely still one of the limitations. There is a big hope that at some point they will address this. But as it stands for now, that's true. GA4 can't handle these custom channel groupings. That's something one would have to do in sort of systems down the line in their own modeling.
Do you have some ideas on how to deal with it? I mean, like considering they might just say no, or it will come a year later. What are we doing this year?
I mean, it really depends on in which system you want to do it, right? If you are leveraging the raw data and modeling it yourself, there are obviously some mappings that you can do based on raw data. If you want to do it in GA4, my intuitive answer would be custom dimensions and those. It's a bit frustrating, I know, but I think for now still the best bet of tackling that.
It's not a bit frustrating, it's a fucking waste. I mean, like, it's really... Thanks, guys.
Working? Can you hear me? Yeah. So a little bit similar question with...
I think you have to hold it really close to
very
your mouth.
close,
It's
okay.
very sensitive.
It's better. So I have one question, maybe a little bit similar what was asked. Do you know already some companies that actually implemented G4 and you could share what is actual experience, what the difficulties they have in the comparison universal to G4? So something that we could learn and avoid maybe when we do it, because it's something that you're obviously also planning. Thank you.
I mean, we have, so Vero is definitely the one who has the most experience with these migrations. We have implemented GA4 at other ventures as well. I'm actually currently also involved in a project where we are doing it. There we have a bit of the advantage that the UA setup was not super complex, not super massive. So for now, the complexity there is a bit different. But for example, now we're currently also talking with one of our ventures who have actually a super complex universal analytics setup, and there the migration will definitely be something where 2 weeks of planning probably isn't enough to get it done. I think in, let's say, half a year, we will be able to share a lot more of learnings of what the migrations actually led to in the long run. I think now, with the recent announcement, was just too short of a time to see the real impact for many.
Maybe just one thing from my side to watch out, not really, not a learning, but basically GA4 models kind of data for traffic which is potentially untracked. So in the UI you will see basically the real tracked conversions, plus basically something which is predicted or modeled by GA. And if you then work with the raw data, you obviously only have the events which are actually tracked. So basically you will be, as of now, technically not able to reproduce everything you see in the UI. So this is, right now, probably an unfortunate situation you need to consider, but at least it helps to explain it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I just wanted to know, like, the entire world must be transitioning to Google for analytics right now. So what kind of support is Google giving on this? Is there, they must have a lot of documentation, but like, is there anything that they do?
I would say in classic Google fashion, it really depends. There are some things that are very nicely documented where you can really rely on their documentation, and then there are other things where you will really rather need to depend on outside information. There are very valuable, let's say, content producers that have blogs, articles, content on YouTube that really go into the details by, I guess in their case, often like just testing it out a lot immediately when it comes out, and then providing insights on how things work and how we can leverage those. So yeah, Google is supporting, but it could be better. That's always a bit of a mixed bag, I would say. What was your experience so far?
Yeah, similar. So I would rather rely on the user-generated content. I mean, the guidelines of Google basically give you a base, but the good thing is that more or less, since everybody is using GA, you have tons of user-generated content and basically people who had a similar issue and hopefully solved it a couple of weeks ago already.
I think we don't have any more time for questions, but you feel free to approach the guys just after.